Okay, good morning and welcome again, everyone, to the Lake Simcoe Science Forum hosted by the Latornell Conservation Symposium. We've had almost 450 registrants to this event this morning, and we're excited that you've joined us. My name is Michael Dakin. I'm a member of the Latornell Steering Committee, and I'm Supervisor of Development Review at Cataraqui Conservation here in Kingston, Ontario. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and staff from the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, I'd like you to welcome you to the Latornell webinar series. Before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and then some housekeeping items. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that where I'm located here in Kingston, the land we know as the Cataraqui region, it's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. At Cataraqui Conservation, we are committed to learning from and alongside the Indigenous peoples of this land on how we can be reciprocal guardians of the land. We thank the Indigenous peoples for their continued care and protection of all our relations. We're dedicated to ensuring that all of creation is preserved and promoting sustainable living in our community with direct actions that benefit Indigenous access to protected lands. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you're joining us today from many places near and far and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. The webinar today is part of an ongoing series of webinars presented by the Latornell Conservation Symposium, which celebrated its 30th anniversary last year in November. You can find recordings of our previous webinars on YouTube, which we'll link to in the chat. So our moderator for today's forum is Laura Benacoon. Laura is the supervisor of the biomonitoring unit at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, which is responsible for the ministry's long-term monitoring program of Lake Simcoe's water quality and lower food web. Prior to joining the biomonitoring unit as a supervisor, Laura was a senior surface water scientist at the MECP. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Before we start, we'll just do a few housekeeping notes. All attendees are muted, so please use the Q&A panel for questions anytime, and you also have the ability to upvote those questions that you'd like prioritized. As mentioned, today's session is recorded and auto captions are enabled. They can be found under the More button at the bottom. So let's take a look at the results of the poll from where folks are coming from today. We've got lots of folks from Southern Ontario and Central Ontario, almost half, which is great to see. And then a few more folks coming in from the Greater Toronto area. So lots of folks from around Lake Simcoe, which makes a lot of sense. And we're all really, really glad that you could join us. But folks from from everywhere, pardon me. It's great to see the sort of the breadth of the interest that is available here today. And we're really, really glad that you could join us. So if we pop over to the next slide, which has our session overview, I'm just going to go over what we're going to be covering today. So the first speaker that we have will be discussing natural heritage and invasive species, watershed management, and then we will be having a very short break. Today's schedule is very tightly packed, so it'll just be a 10-minute break, and then we'll start promptly at 10:19 with some water quality trends, talking about some status and changes in aquatic life and fisheries, and then we'll have a lightning round, which is a format that has very, very short talks, all one after the other, and then a big Q&A session at the end. So it's going to be a very busy day, and again, please make sure that you're putting your comments and questions, your questions into the Q&A and upvoting them so that we can make sure that we get the questions that are of most interest to folks answered primarily. So our first speaker for this morning is Daniela Puric-Mladenovic. She is the assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where she leads the Forests in Settled and Urban Landscapes program and lab. Prior to joining U of T, Daniela worked at the Ministry of Natural Resources. Today, she will be sharing monitoring and tracking changes in natural cover in Lake Simcoe watershed. Welcome, Daniela.
Thank you so much. As we are tight with time, I'll move on immediately with my presentation. I'll be talking about natural cover monitoring in the lakes.
Oh, Daniela, we lost your mic. You're going to need to unmute yourself again.
I'm sorry, my slides are stuck. Just what I needed this morning. Let me try again. Yeah. So the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, it's one of the first plans that I know in Canada that makes the link between natural cover and the quality of the lake, which led to including natural cover monitoring and also understanding the quality of natural cover, which led to establishing set of monitoring plots across the Lake Simcoe watershed. They were established as a baseline condition in 2017 and permanently marked, and they are spread across both public and private lands. The baseline information enabled developing a set of monitoring indicators and, as I said, establishing the baseline condition so we know what was the state in 2017. Some of the indicators that are here definitely for forested condition, above ground biomass, floristic quality, weedless index, which is linked to non-native and invasive species, dead biomass, forest regeneration, and forest structure. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I'll just touch on what we discovered during this process. The first thing that we discovered was that for forest cover, we should look at more from successional stage, that where we look early, mid, and late successional forest, and apply those indicators accordingly. Based on that, we developed the mapping for the Lake Simcoe watershed that sparse forest cover into several classes. And it was no surprise that about half of the forest cover, it's intermediate stage of forest succession. Above ground biomass obviously was derived from the plot data, and with support from the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority, we were able to map and model biomass across the entire Lake Simcoe watershed. So what this shows, the areas where we have higher biomass. And if you look at this map, it shows, let's say, these orange areas, area where we're reaching out the maximum of the biomass. The second indicator is floristic quality, which look at natural cover, not just in terms of trees, but it takes into account all plants. And what that enable us to look what's the average floristic quality for the whole watershed. And it's an indicator that has been proven show changes over time. And we've seen that across different natural cover, the value as expected of floristic quality changes. And obviously some very sensitive communities like bogs have the highest floristic quality. The idea that we need to look at forest cover as successional stages, it's also proven by floristic quality, where we see that late cereal communities have higher floristic quality as opposed to early and mid successional. We were able to extrapolate, not to model, floristic quality across the watershed, and that has shown us that some obviously watersheds are doing better in terms of floristic quality, that they have higher floristic quality, but also less variation in terms of how it's changing across natural cover. Part of this work was also looking at non-native and invasive plants, and I'm not going into all details about this, but it was quite discovery to see that at least 62% of sites had European buckthorn present. 74% of sites had at least one invasive species, and there were quite a few non-native plants captured across the watershed. About 20% of plants are non-native. The other part that wasn't part of this work but enabled us to use Lake Simcoe monitoring plots and look at black ash distribution across the Lake Simcoe watershed and model where we have black ash, which at the time of sampling, when we started, wasn't still impacted by emerald ash borer. And considering the change that happened over 10 years, we see a huge decline, which is part of the other project that we have. What we learned from this is that it's good to have the baseline condition, but we are reaching our 10 years, and it would be great to go back and really evaluate what's the change across the landscape, because as I mentioned, EAB, we know that impact it's quite significant. Obviously, continued research and modeling and predicting these indicators across the landscape. The baseline condition also give us quite a solid information that we can start establishing some threshold and reference condition across the landscape. As an example, the biomass, that high biomass across the watershed. Obviously, knowledge transfer, it's a huge component of this work, and something that why do we do monitor, how this information can support management applications. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Daniela. So we have a few questions in the chat, and we're doing well in terms of time, which is great.
Okay.
So the first question comes from Claire Malcolmson, who asks, what steps have been taken to protect this natural cover? Please provide the percentage of the watershed that was in natural cover in 2010 versus now.
I personally do not have the information on how the protection is done. We have the solid baseline in 2017 that we can now look what has happened in the past 10 years. In terms of the protection, obviously there are different municipalities, private landowners, bylaws, which definitely could be evaluated with the data that we have.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Martin Mostart as well. Before I just go back to the next question from Claire, which is, which CITES species were present and are they healthy?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that one.
Which CITES species were present and are they healthy?
Sorry, I'm not the acronym. I'm not sure what it is.
Okay, Martin, maybe you could add in. I recognize the acronym, but I can't remember it right now. So there's another one that's just come in, which is, does the proposed ALTO fast train go through this watershed? And if so, have Native groups been involved? Oh, I think that's Native groups as in Indigenous groups, not native plants. So Daniela, that might, I don't think you would know the answer to that.
I wouldn't, but as I said, it's probably, I'm repeating myself, having the baseline and being able to look spatially, but also in terms of composition of what's happening. We can only say if you go back and measure the impact of what has happened over 10 years. Definitely we have a solid baseline that we can do that.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go back to Claire's second question, which is, how has the province met the requirements of the LSPP by preventing the introduction of new invasive species? Black ash is no longer protected by the province.
I mean, obviously, the ecology, it's shifting, but also our policies are shifting, and decision-making is shifting and changing. I can only speak in terms of ecology, what we see. In terms of the black ash, as I said, we are going back to some of these sites to see the change. but I cannot speak about the policy itself.
Okay, thank you. We got some clarification from Martin. Thank you. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered
Yeah,
Species. So Martin was asking about endangered
yeah.
species in the survey.
I mean, from the ecology side, I can say one thing that was quite surprise for us to see invasive species, even in some in areas that we would consider intact. And I can tell you that based on my work, this Lake Simcoe watershed, it's no different than other areas. That doesn't mean that we should accept what's going on. And definitely, based on this work, we could set and find the jewels on the landscape where there is less impact of invasive species, and maybe put our efforts in those areas to protect them, more.
Thank you. I'm just checking the QA, and I believe most of the questions have. Oh, there's one that came in from Heather Ireland. This might be our last question before we move on, which is how many sites were evaluated to calculate the invasive species percentage?
700, because for the baseline monitoring, we have stakes at about 400 plots. For the rest of the plots, they were part of the research, and the geographic coordinates, it's sub-meter accuracy. So it's a fairly high. I don't know any watershed in Canada that has this amount of information. And as I said, what's important here is both public and private land. So it's not just basing it on public land.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Daniela.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Francine McDonald from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and she will be sharing provincial updates and the status of invasive species in Lake Simcoe. Francine is a senior invasive species policy and program advisor with MNR and has nearly 3 decades of experience addressing invasive species. Go ahead, Francine.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. And can you see my slides?
Again, yes. Well done.
Okay, good. I'm starting off the right way this morning. Yes, I work with the Ministry of Natural Resources in a section called Biodiversity and Invasive Species. And I'm just going to give a short update today on invasive species within Lake Simcoe. Oops. Just a quick background, of course. Invasive species are not a new issue to Lake Simcoe. The concerns around invasives have been, have a long history, with first introduction occurring with common carp well over 100 years ago. And subsequent invasions over that past century have had significant impact on Simcoe and the aquatic ecosystems within it. I'd say that probably the ones that are most sort of we are familiar with are Eurasian milfoil and the invasion of zebra mussel and round goby in the last 2 decades. I'd say that those detections, zebra mussels and round goby, were probably, I think, an alarm call, and resulted in their invasive species being included in the Lake Simcoe Prevention Plan or Protection Plan in 2009. And I really want to highlight how important this plan is. It was one of the first plans in Canada, I think, that developed sort of an approach to addressing invasive species on a watershed basis. And I think it was truly an important piece of policy. And that was followed actually by our own provincial invasive species strategic plan, which was introduced in 2012. There we go. So just to focus on the prevention or protection plan, the goal is for invasive species is to respond to adverse effects of invasive species and where possible prevent invasive species from entering the Lake Simcoe watershed. So those two pieces are critical. Number one, prevention. So within prevention, we look at prioritizing high-risk threats. We look at opportunities to prevent through policy and regulation, and as well as look at the pathways for which invasive species may be introduced and focus our outreach efforts on those pathways. Second aspect is detect and respond. We need to be vigilant for new introductions and act as swiftly as possible to respond when they're detected. So in terms of a prevention-focused approach for Lake Simcoe, an invasive species watch list was developed for Lake Simcoe. It includes about 20 species that compose threats to forests. Examples are Asian longhorn beetle, hemlock woolly adelgid, and oak wilt. Threats to wildlife, we have wild boar, chronic wasting disease, which impacts wild deer. Threats to wetlands, water soldier, parrot feather, fanwort. These are primarily water garden and aquarium species. And then threats to aquatic life. Probably most of you have heard of invasive carp that have caused massive impacts in the Mississippi River Basin in the US. And there's a threat of them arriving in the Great Lakes. And other fish species as well, like the northern snakehead and crayfish species like the yabby. So these were identified as being high-risk threats. And those are the species that we've prioritized to prevent introduction and focus early detection and response efforts on. One of the key efforts with those 20 species is regulation. So all of those species have now been regulated either under our own Ontario Invasive Species Act or federally under the Canada's Plant Protection Act and Animal Health Act. We've also regulated watercraft as a carrier of invasive species, recognizing that the overland transport of boats can introduce new species. So now it essentially requires the clean, drain, dry practice as being the law. So I've highlighted oak wilt and water soldier because those are two species which we've recently detected in Lake Simcoe Watershed. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about those two species. So oak wilt. Oak wilt is a very serious tree disease, and it's caused by a fungus, which is carried by insects from infected trees. It was detected in 2023 in 3 locations in Ontario. It was found in 2 sites in the Niagara region and 1 site in the township of Springwater in the Lake Simcoe watershed. These detections were actually reported by the public. So I think that I really want to highlight the importance of the public in communicating detections because these 3 reports were found by individual citizens who reported. The detections resulted in a rapid response by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and many partners, which resulted in the removal of the infected trees. And the good news is that following the removal of the infected tree, the 3 trees, there have been no oak wilt detections in 2024 or 2025. So we haven't, I guess we've also been focused on doing surveillance as well. So MNR has been leading environmental DNA surveys for pathogens on the insects. So we have found no eDNA detections in Simcoe County, but there have been a few detections in other areas. So the detections are of insects that may be carrying the pathogen. So that suggests that some insects may be coming from windblown areas in highly infested areas in Michigan or New York and passing through within Ontario. So we need to be aware of the risk. And I should note the picture here. The picture is of leaves of oak wilt that have been infected by infected trees, sorry. And you can see sort of the stages of infection, sort of the bronzing of the tips of the leaves is a good sign of impact. So in terms of oak wilt prevention or management, I said that we need to be aware of the risk, and it's really important to avoid wounding oak trees between April and October, especially between bud break and July 31st. That's how the pathogen can be introduced to the tree. So it's really important to be careful not to wound trees during that time period. The symptoms of oak wilt, look for a sudden onset of symptoms. Red oak is particularly vulnerable, white oaks less so. Look for early leaf drop between July and September, and look for slowly expanding pockets of mortality. It's really important to report suspected trees to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and I'll have a reporting line available at the end of the talk that you can get. Okay. So the second invader I wanted to talk about was water soldier. This species is an aquatic invasive plant. It's native to Europe. It was first found in Ontario in 2008. It grows extremely rapidly, outcompeting native vegetation and impeding recreation and navigation and many activities like fishing and swimming. Unfortunately, it was detected in Cook's Bay in Lake Simcoe in July 2024. We don't know how it arrived in Lake Simcoe. There are other populations in the Trent Severn Waterway below Rice Lake and in the Bay of Quinte and the Red Horse Lake, which is in the Gananoque River watershed. But this is an isolated detection in Simcoe. With the detection, an interagency working group has been established to monitor and assess options for management. So a significant surveillance effort was undertaken last summer. That team of monitoring was conducted by the OFAH, Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Chippewas of Rama First Nation, and the Chippewas of Georgina Island. I really want to emphasize how significant their effort was this past year to monitor Lake Simcoe to assess the distribution of water soldier in the lake. They monitored over 5,000 hectares, and the detection or their surveillance efforts resulted in an assessment of about 450 hectares of water soldier in Cook's Bay. The positive information is that there were no detections in the Hollowin River or in Lake Couchiching, but the population in the Cook's Bay is certainly significant. It exists primarily in southern Cook's Bay between Keswick and Guilford Beach. And then isolated populations were found in Lefroy Harbor on the west shore and Roaches Point on the east shore. This is just a picture of what infestation of water soldier looks like. You can see the extent of the population in these pictures. The one picture on the right is of a drone photo taken by Ducks Unlimited. This is a very significant size population, and you can see on the left-hand side picture, you've got the emergent form of the plant as well as the submergent form. So this detection is of great concern. What we know is that the plants are so far are contained in Cook's Bay, but the spread risk is increasing. This is a significant problem, and no single agency can manage this alone. We really think that cross-agency coordination is really essential, which is why we've established a working group to focus on developing an integrated management plan to help gather data, look at management options, look at the approaches that have been used in other parts of the province where the plant has been found, and look at sort of how we can effectively prevent further spread and manage the populations that we have. New members are welcome to the working group, and I've indicated the contact name for the person to follow up with the Invasive Species Center. So finally, I just wanted to also reference that the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan has just been released. for public comment. It's a renewal of the 2012 plan. We're seeking public comment on the plan, and I think it's the renewal of this plan is important because it reaffirms sort of provincial commitment to addressing invasive species in the province. Okay, and that's that. Here's some context for more information. I did want to highlight the existence of several funding opportunities through the Invasive Species Action Fund and the Ontario Phragmites Action Program. And reporting can be made to the Invading Species Hotline and the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And that's it.
Thanks, Francine. That was great. We've got a few questions in the chat. Just sort of following up from this this mention that you have of funding and partnership opportunities. There was a question from Julian, which says, when you mention how important knowledge transfer is, how will the 2027 research engage local communities in monitoring? Are there any opportunities for community groups? So are community groups able to participate in any of the stuff that you mentioned here?
Absolutely. There actually were several volunteer events. They're called Paddle for a Purpose, where volunteers can get out on the lake and help monitor for water soldier. So those will definitely be happening again next year. And we really encourage public participation in these kinds of events, as well as not just monitoring, but also we also have a campaign called See It, Pull It, which is, encourages people to help with control actions if they follow specific rules. So it's, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Rob, I see your question here. It sounds like it might also be answered later, but we'll give a chance for Francine to put in some of her comments, which was, weren't zebra mussels introduced into Lake Simcoe in the early 1990s? From the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority website, by 1995, zebra mussels had established themselves in Lake Simcoe, followed by quagga mussels in 2004.
Yeah, that's correct. Did I have that wrong in the slides?
I'm not sure.
Oh, but yeah, absolutely. That was around the time of zebra mussel invasion. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago to those of us who've been around a while, but yeah, it's several decades now.
I mean, the 90s were only 10 years ago, so it's a reasonable mistake to make.
Well, they were, yeah.
I know. All right, let's go back to Claire, who has a question asking, did the province pay for the work done by OFAH and First Nations regarding the water soldier?
Yeah, we provided funding support through the Invasive Species Action Fund to help fund some of the monitoring work that was done. There's also funding provided as well through initiatives like Canada Summer Jobs, which helped hire some of the summer students as well. So with this kind of work, I think, one single funding source isn't, you have to work with partners to combine your funds and expand your leverage. So yes, the province absolutely provided funding support, but there was also support provided from other sources as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. And from Michael Rogers, Francine, can you share some of the major updates in the invasive species strategic plan, and if there's anything specific that helps to address oak wilt or water soldier?
So I would say that the plan doesn't specifically focus on individual species, but it provides sort of a renewal of the approaches that have been applied. So the prevention, detection, response, and management sort of key goals. Significant changes in the new plan versus the old plan. The new plan includes a chapter on Indigenous engagement and participation, which surprisingly the first plan didn't actually reference, but this new plan has a full chapter on the importance of that aspect of work. There's also an emphasis on the economic impacts of invasive species. I think there's an effort to further engage with industry because invasives have not only a huge impact on the environment, but also on the economy, and sort of that effort to engage with industry and sectors to help prevent introductions is also a big component of the new plan as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Rob, who's asking, how can we best slow or eliminate the spread of water soldier into other lakes and water bodies in the Trent Severn system? And mentioning the Clean Drain Dry program.
Public awareness is really important, so the movement of your watercraft from one lake to the other, the removing vegetation from your boat and trailer, the following the clean drain dry practices, which are actually a rule, are critical. For water soldier, it started out as a water garden plant, and now it's regulated and it's a prohibited species, and you can't sell it as a water garden plant. But certainly, being aware of the species that you use in your water garden is very, very important, and ensuring that try to use native plant species in gardens and don't allow sort of escapement into natural water as well. So there's twofold. So watercraft, preventing spread, and then don't introduce new species to the environment in the first place through your own practices. Yeah.
Right on. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Which is, are there any updates on the level of disruption and size of populations for common carp and brown goby in Lake Simcoe?
Ooh, I think those are questions for my colleagues with the aquatic research and monitoring section that are going to be following up later on. They focus more on fisheries assessment, so I'll leave it to them to answer that question.
Okay, we'll leave a comment in the chat then. And,
okay, great.
And folks can answer it later.
Okay.
So last one with 5 upvotes here is from Michael Rogers. What species not present in Lake Simcoe are the main focus for early detection at this time?
So the least wanted list that I mentioned at the beginning, that includes 20 species. So only 2 have been detected in Lake Simcoe. So there's 18 more that haven't. So I encourage you to learn more about the Lake Simcoe least wanted list. There's the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters actually has a booklet which highlights the least wanted, and maybe we'll include that in the chat, a link to it, so that people can follow up with that great resource, because it's really focused on preventing and that those detections of oak wilt, as I said before, were found by the public. So it's such an important role for the public to be aware of these least wanted species.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Francine. Yeah. And thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. I know that we don't have the ability to get through everybody's questions, but we'll try and answer what we can in the chat. And then you're also able to follow up by email afterwards with presenters. So let's head over to our next presenter. Please welcome Bill Thompson from the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority to discuss the evolution of subwatershed planning in the Lake Simcoe watershed. Bill is the manager of watershed plans and strategies at the LSRCA, where he leads the development of evidence-based watershed and climate action plans. Bill, over to you. Bill, we can't hear you. You're not marked as your microphone being off, so you may want to check if your volume is low or if it's connected. Nope, still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Just had to change my mic. Apologize for that. So, yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity today to present on our subwatershed planning program and to show how we take some of the science you're hearing about from other presenters and put it into action in the Lake Simcoe watershed. And we do that, at least in my team, through the subwatershed planning program, because subwatershed plans are a really effective tool to do that job because of policies in the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan or the Growth Plan or the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan that says things like municipal official plans, infrastructure master plans, major developments shall be consistent with or consider recommendations in the applicable watershed or sub-watershed plan. So that provides us a really powerful tool to get in front of some of those major land use changes we see ongoing in the Lake Simcoe watershed. As you'll see, I hope later in the presentation, though, it's not just about influencing municipal land use changes, but sub-watershed planning has helped us refine some of our programming within the Conservation Authority as well. Watershed planning is nothing new for the Conservation Authority. It's one of the first, if not the first thing we did when our predecessor organization was formed. Back in 1953, what was then called the Upper Holland Conservation Authority developed what was called a conservation report, but very much was what we would call today a watershed plan. And then that plan has been updated from time to time as things change, as stressors on the watershed and the lake have changed, as our jurisdictional boundaries have changed, as we've expanded over the years. And most recently, we published a series of sub-watershed plans for each of the major tributaries flowing to the Lake Simcoe. So a sub-watershed plan is essentially a watershed plan, but written for a river rather than for the lake itself. But even with the sub-watershed plans, they're getting a little bit dated now as well. They were published between 2010 and 2016. So again, time has passed. Pressures perhaps have changed on the landscape. We've learned a lot in the intervening years about trends in environmental conditions. There's been lots of research supported by MECP and others, as you hear about in today's session. And of course, there's been lots of changes to both provincial land use planning policy as well as local official plans. So perhaps it's time to update these documents. But before going through a process of updating, we wanted to take a step back and assess whether or not the sub-watershed plans were doing what they were intended to do, whether they were kind of landing the way we hoped they would land. And so we undertook what we called at the time an after-action review, where we surveyed all of our kind of primary audience of the sub-watershed plans to get a sense from them as to whether they were using them or not, and to what extent and how often, what they liked about the plans, what they didn't like about the plans. And that audience included municipal staff involved in the land use planning and capital development side, our own internal colleagues, and we did a survey of some of our peers and other conservation authorities as well to get a sense of how their watershed planning programs were being run. And we found through that that the watershed plans were being well used by municipalities, which was certainly positive to hear. They were used very frequently and by a broad range of people for in fact, a broader range of roles than we had anticipated. They were being used as designed to inform land use planning and capital development planning, but we found they were also being used to support development of kind of internal operational policies, and as a reference tool either to answer public questions about the state of their local neighborhood, or just to help staff understand context of areas where they were working. Like anything, though, there were areas for improvement identified, and so there was a request for more detailed mapping in the plans. That was certainly understandable. The plans were published as a PDF document as kind of 8.5 by 11 pages, and so putting an area the size of a sub-watershed onto an 8.5 by 11 map necessarily limits the amount of detail you can provide. Even when we did this after action review, the documents were getting a little bit out of date, and so there was a request to have them updated more frequently. And then most interestingly, we had a request to make the documents shorter and more succinct, but also have more detail. And I think that kind of that pair of requests reflects the fact that the sub-watershed plans cover a broad range of topics and subject area expertise. And any one reader probably wants 5 to 10 pages out of a 200-page document, not too concerned about the other 295 pages, but maybe what they want their 5 to 10 pages to be 10 or 15 pages. So we took this feedback in hand and started a process to update and modernize our watershed planning program. And one of the major changes we've done is we've moved from those hard copy or PDF documents into an online form through ArcGIS Online. And this ArcGIS Online allows us to answer some of these requests we got from our audience. For example, because it's based on ArcGIS, we can present a map such that the sub-watershed is now kind of scaled to a computer monitor, but the app is interactive such that the user can zoom in and zoom out and pan around to the extent that they need to make their area of interest a central focus in the mapping we provide. Similarly, we can provide what I call here near real-time data, in that we can update our figures, our tables, as often as we want, which typically is on an annual basis. And we can update the content as often as we need to as well, much more quickly than we could through a hard copy document. And particularly because this is an online format, we can provide something that's relatively succinct and quick to read, but rich in hyperlinks, so that those who want more detail can dive kind of to their heart's extent, much the way you might on a Wikipedia type website. So now this platform is in place, we're in the process of going back to the sub-watershed plans themselves and their recommendations to update those recommendations for action, to make sure they address some of the new and emerging issues in the watershed. And that process, while it's just starting, is one we will be engaging a lot of partners in helping us through. So over the time, our watershed planning program has evolved as, again, population has changed, jurisdictional boundaries have changed, but issues have evolved as well. And so one of my colleagues a couple of years ago had the opportunity to go through some of those historic documents in some depth. And this figure is one of the results of that exercise, where the boxes on the left are essentially time points or eras in settlement in the Lake Simcoe watershed, and later the development and expansion of the Conservation Authority and the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. And then the boxes on the right are various watershed management issues that were identified in policy documents, and the arrows represent kind of when they appeared and disappeared from policy documents or watershed plans. And you can see from the arrows that basically nothing has disappeared. What this represents here is that watershed management has become more complex over time. A lot of the issues in that first 1953 report were related to loss of forest cover, land use change, urbanization. Those are still stressors we're dealing with now, but over time, of course, stressors have multiplied as the world has gotten more complex and issues have gotten more continental and global in nature. So issues have evolved, watershed plans have evolved, our programming at the Conservation Authority has had to evolve as well. And so I'm going to shift gears here a little bit for the remainder of my presentation and talk about two new program areas in the Conservation Authority to address some of these new threats. And the first one I want to talk about is winter salt. So this figure on the graph here is really what's driven our new program area around winter salt. This is a graph showing the trend in chloride concentration at Atherley Narrows since we started monitoring back in 1971. So those of you who know Lake Simcoe know that it flows north and water exits the lake at Atherley Narrows in Aurelia and ultimately flowing into Georgian Bay. So water quality at Atherley Narrows is kind of the accumulation of all the tributary inputs and all the in-lake processes. And this represents kind of that cumulative sense of chloride in Lake Simcoe. And you can see this ongoing trend since the 1970s is pretty stable and pretty disturbing. So our sub-watershed plans had a number of recommendations to try to bend this curve. Things like engaging users of winter salt to promote better or broader adoption rather of better practices, to gain an understanding of the barriers to some of the adoption of those better practices, and then to the extent we can to address those barriers. And I say winter salt because winter salt really is the source primarily of the chloride in the lake. We started this whole program by doing a survey of roads managers and parking lot operators in the watershed, and found almost a perfect match between the amount of salt that's being put on roads and parking lots and sidewalks in the winter and the amount of chloride we're seeing in the tributaries. So primarily this is a winter salt issue, but through that survey we also found a couple of other important facts. One, that the source is essentially shared between local roads, regional roads, provincial highways, and parking lots. Now, these are new audiences for us. We haven't typically dealt a lot with roads operators, and we certainly haven't dealt with parking lot operators in the past. So these are new audiences for us to work with. And the second point here is that it really is something we can't just focus on one of those audiences. We need to deal with both of them or all of them, because this really is kind of a shared contribution here. So this program area was very much one that was an engagement-first approach, where we started out by engaging these users of salt to talk about the issue, talk about some of those barriers, and how we could work together to address them. And we did that through two ways. On the road side, we have something called the Lake Simcoe Salt Working Group. This group is a venue that meets once or twice a year, where we invite in staff from upper tier urbanizing and urban municipalities in the watershed, because those are the ones that tend to use more salt. And it's road staff as well as land use planners and those responsible for source water protection or drinking water, and our staff as well. And these meetings typically are a presentation from our staff talking about current trends in chloride or some of our research on better practices or impacts of chloride on the environment. And then we'll offer the floor up to one or two municipalities to talk about pilot projects that they've been undertaking. We did find very early on that municipalities are adopting pilot projects to try new ways of maintaining roads in the winter. But perhaps, municipality A might be trying a pilot of something that municipality B did a couple of years ago. So one of the reasons for maintaining this group is to drive down barriers of communication between municipalities and therefore promote a more rapid uptake of best practice pilots that do seem to work. And we've also tried to support that by publishing a number of brief technical reports through the STEP program, taking lessons learned from these pilots and from research we've done to talk about and to answer some of the common questions we get around which is better for the environment, salt or sand, if not sodium chloride, then what else? So that's on the road side. On the parking lot side, we approach them separately because their drivers are different. And we structured something we call the Ontario Freshwater Roundtable. And this roundtable was intended to be an opportunity for us to talk to some of the major parking lot contractors active in the watershed, but also to talk with their clients at the same time, so that all sectors are around the table to talk about this emerging environmental issue. And so much like the SALT working group, this was an opportunity for us to talk about the issue, to raise profile of the issue, and for practitioners and property managers to talk about their operational realities. Very quickly, this group came to the agreement that this was a shared problem, but there is a shared solution. And those of you who have heard me talk about SALT in the past will have heard me talk about the New Hampshire model, because we think part of the solution is Ontario adopting the New Hampshire model of limited liability. And so this roundtable got together and published a discussion paper that outlines that path forward. And through this, we've been trying to, again, do what we can to address some of the barriers to adoption of better practices. Oftentimes, some of the barriers we hear about is concern around increasing liability if I change from conventional practices to something new. So we published a couple of case studies where we were able to get actual real-world data from our watershed, both from a road system as well as a private parking lot, where operators did move from conventional practices to better practices, and we were able to work up some data to show that it is a triple bottom line win-win-win scenario where you can save some money, you can reduce your environmental footprint by using less chloride, and you can keep the surface just as safe by shifting to better practices compared to conventional practices. And then finally, we took some of these lessons and applied them to parking lot design guidelines, recognizing the Lake Simcoe watershed is one that's experiencing a lot of development pressure and will probably for the course of my career. So if we're trying to bend that curve in chloride at Atherley Narrows, we have to do better in future development than we have in the past. And one way to do that is make sure sites are designed with winter maintenance in mind to make it easier to take on some of these better practices and to avoid some of the problem spot areas that tend to require over-application of salt. The other new program area I want to talk about briefly today is programming we have around stormwater management. So in the Lake Simcoe watershed since 1995, there has been a requirement that all new developments have a stormwater pond to address both water quantity and water quality of water flowing off that development. That's certainly better than having nothing, but we found over time that stormwater ponds aren't the silver bullet, they're not the panacea. There is ongoing geomorphic issues during high flow events when big blasts of water come out of ponds. Ponds don't do anything, of course, to offset the loss of infiltration and recharge of aquifers that's associated with increased pavement cover. And over time, unfortunately, we've seen maintenance deficits increase if these features aren't invested in and maintained over time. And unfortunately, that maintenance deficit can lead to a loss of functioning. And in extreme cases, stormwater ponds can become sources of phosphorus back to the watershed. We know as well, though, that, again, development pressure is our reality. And while these systems are imperfect, we're getting more imperfect systems on the watershed all the time. So again, we had a series of recommendations in our sub-watershed plans to try to address this emerging issue. including promoting adoption of low-impact development practice to stormwater management, particularly infiltration-based practices, to promote greater maintenance of existing facilities, and to explore supplementary measures like street sweeping or catch basin inserts to provide additional support around phosphorus reduction. Like the SALT, this was very much an engagement-first approach where we established a working group made up of municipal staff and practitioners to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges represented by new approaches to stormwater management, to co-write policies related to stormwater management that could be applied to any municipality in the watershed. We've provided training, again, to municipal staff and practitioners, both on the design and the maintenance of both stormwater, so conventional stormwater ponds, as well as low-impact development features. And with funding support from both MECP and Environment Canada, we've established a set of LED demonstration sites in a number of very public-facing properties across the watershed. And the intent of this was to work hand in hand with municipalities on their first LED so they could understand and have support in understanding some of the nuances around both the design and the construction and the maintenance of these facilities. And by putting them in very public spots, we're able to show to the public that these can be very attractive facilities when designed right and operating correctly, or maintained right, I should have said. As you can see in the photo on the right here, which is a very lovely, what some might see as a flower garden, we see as a stormwater management facility. So that now that this training and these demonstration sites are in place, we're in a phase of mainstreaming or operationalizing some of these new programs through things like updates to our stormwater management guidelines that talk about site level control of stormwater being the first approach, end of pipe being a much later approach. By having funding in our restoration program, either to support municipalities who want to upgrade existing stormwater ponds, or to support either municipalities or private landowners who want to take on a low impact development feature on their property, like the one in the central photo here. And we have a service we provide for interested municipalities to do inspections of their stormwater ponds, so they have a really solid understanding of their operations and any maintenance deficit that might be accruing. So over time, I think we've been able to see a subwatershed plan that's been, or a planning program rather, that's been quite effective. We've heard from our primary audience that they do use and value these documents. As we move from that hard copy document to the online platform, we're finding it's well used as well. And perhaps most importantly, all of the recommendations in the subwatershed plans have largely been implemented now. And through that, there have been new successful programs like the two I just spoke about have been developed. Factors underpinning this success, I think one of the major factors is that we don't just write these documents and assume they're going to be implemented. We've created a staff position called an implementation coordinator, who's responsible for keeping focus on these documents after they're written and make sure those recommendations get acted on. And part of that is an annual progress report that we've published. And part of that is an annual meeting of implementing partners to give updates to one another, and again, to talk about barriers and opportunities. This has made very easy for us in the watershed, as we've got some very engaged municipal partners. There's been a ton of support in all the municipalities around the watershed to work with us to improve the health of Lake Simcoe. There's been corporate investments in these new programs. And when I say corporate, I mean the Conservation Authority. These aren't programs that my little team is trying to run. These are programs that the conservation as a whole is trying to run. And finally, we've had a lot of support over the years from MECP through the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan program, both in terms of funding and technical support. So I like to say watershed planning is never done, because watershed management is never done. And maybe in one of these events, 5 or 10 years from now, somebody's going to be here talking about the next evolution of watershed planning. But certainly, as someone who's been managing this program for the past number of years, it's been a fascinating evolution to be part of. And I think an exciting few years to come in the future. So again, thanks very much for your time. If there are any time for any questions, I'm happy to answer to the best that I can.
Thanks, Bill. We do have a couple of questions. Our first one for you is from Andrew, who is asking, given that watershed management and the conservation of lands have been removed from the CA Act and climate change removed from the water section of the PPS, how are you delivering integrated watershed management?
So watershed management is still referenced in the PPS, in the Greenbelt Plan, in the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, in the Ecological Marine Conservation Plan. So we're carrying forward under that understanding that municipalities are required to have some of those major decisions be informed by watershed plans. And again, just to repeat what I just said, within municipalities in the watershed, those responsible for capital development planning and land use planning are very keen and eager to work with us. So yeah, while provincial policy has changed, local practices haven't.
Thanks, Bob. We have both a comment and a question from Claire, so I'm going to combine them. Thank you, Bill, for all of your excellent research. The lack of progress on this issue is astonishing, given the CA and the NGO and industry push for limited liability for snowplow industry. And her question is, what is the source of revenue that municipalities use to keep stormwater ponds working?
Well, that can vary a little bit from municipality to municipality. It is ultimately a municipal funding model. Many have now moved to a stormwater utility fee. So much the way that you might get a bill from the municipality for the water you use or the wastewater you send back to them. Some also now charge a fee for stormwater management, which they use to invest in those stormwater maintenance.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a question from Sebastian. Can you say more about the New Hampshire model of limited liability?
Yeah. It's often hard not to talk about salt. So thanks for the opportunity. New Hampshire, like us, has an issue of increasing chloride concentration in their lakes and rivers. New Hampshire, like us, has a very similar law around liability. In Ontario, we call it the Occupiers Liability Act, but essentially the wording is the same in both jurisdictions that says if you own or manage a property, you owe a duty of care to people entering your property to keep them safe while they're there. What New Hampshire did is they amended the law a couple years ago that says that if in winter maintenance you can demonstrate you've taken state-recognized training, you've passed a state-recognized exam, and you've followed state-recognized best practices, that you have met that duty of care. So in Ontario, we think the same amendment could be made to our act to say that if you take province-recognized training, pass a provincial recognized exam, and take follow provincially recognized best practices, you can meet your duty of care. So conceptually simple, legally quite short, and we do think applicable here in Ontario.
Thanks very much. All right, I think that concludes the active questions right now. Please feel free to continue asking questions in the QA. Just for simplicity, if you're able to address by name at the beginning of your comment or question who you'd like to address it, it would make it a little bit easier for our panelists to identify and respond. So that would be really helpful. We'll start our break a little bit early. And so it is 10:02 now. Let's give ourselves 15 minutes rather than 10. So let's come back at 10:15 and we can get started then. So I will put a note in the chat. So we will break now, and we'll see everybody back here at 10:15 for our next presentation on water quality. Thank you. All right, everybody, it is 10:15, so we're about to get restarted. Just before we go, a reminder to folks to please address your questions in the Q&A going forward with the panelist you would like to address it to specifically. It makes it a lot easier for us to make sure that your questions get addressed as soon as possible. And with that, we're going to switch over to our next presentation. So I'm pleased to introduce Joelle Young and Claire Holton from the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, joined by Brian Ginn from the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority to share key water quality trends up to 2024, including shifts in the phosphorus and dissolved oxygen relationship. Joelle Young is a Lake Simcoe scientist with MECP, where she oversees long-term monitoring of the lake's water quality and lower food web. Claire Holton is an algal and nutrient monitoring scientist at the MECP, supporting provincial monitoring and the reporting on the state of Ontario's environment. Brian Ginn is the limnologist at the LSRCA and one of only 3 certified lake managers in Canada. Claire, Joelle, and Brian, please take it away.
Thanks, Claire. Laura, sorry, my sharing, I just started on my computer seems to be moving slowly with the, okay, wasn't advancing back to the beginning slide. So I'm just having to reshare. Sorry about that. I had it all set up. There we go. How's
Perfect.
that?
That looks great.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And good morning, everyone. And welcome back to our Lake Simcoe Science Forum. So today we're going to talk to you about the water quality of Lake Simcoe. And I will start by providing a background on the water quality monitoring that we do. This is an extensive and collaborative effort between the MECP and the LSRCA, as illustrated on this map with all of our stations. So the monitoring of tributaries, offshore lake sites, and water intakes began back in the 1980s. And more recently, the Conservation Authority has added some nearshore sites. These early programs began as a response to substantial water quality issues that were noted back in the 1970s, such as increased plant growth and algae and cold water fish declines. Data are collected at these sites for many water quality parameters, and all of the data that we collect are then made available online. And we also report on them regularly. So just at the end of last year, we released the 15-year Lake Simcoe monitoring report, and this included data up to 2022. Not just for water quality, it actually included a lot of all monitoring programs on the lake. So some of the information we just learned about natural heritage and invasive species, for example, are also in there. And then the Conservation Authority released just last year their phosphorus loads update to 2023. So an overall theme in the 15-year report is that Lake Simcoe is a changing lake. In today's talk, I'll be providing key water quality trends that will highlight important changes that are happening in the lake and in more recent years. Brian will then present an overview of the key drivers of recent change, invasive species, and climate change. And these drivers have added substantial complexity to how the lake functions. So Claire will finish our talk by describing some of these complexities and how we're working to better understand them. And for more information, we encourage you to refer to the recent reports and data online, for which QR codes will be provided at the end of the talk or by request. So while phosphorus has long been the main pollutant of concern in Lake Simcoe, we're now showing of increasing concern is chloride, and Bill just highlighted that in the last talk. Chloride levels are rising at almost every station we monitor. The top graph shows annual averages of chloride from 1980 to 2024 for 6 tributaries. And we can see that the East Holland River and Lovers Creek have both surpassed the Canadian Water Quality Chronic Guideline of 120 milligrams per liter. This is shown as the dotted line. Constant exposure at this level could impair sensitive aquatic life. At times, the chloride levels can be much higher. As an extreme example, Western Creek, a small tributary of East Holland and Newmarket, exceeded the concentration of seawater on 3 days last winter. The bottom graph, which has the same scale as the top, shows the ice-free chloride averages for the lake stations. And levels are rising rapidly there as well. For example, at station C1, chloride concentration was 10 milligrams per liter back in 1980 and is now over 70 milligrams per liter. If chloride continues to rise at its recent rate, the lake could reach the chronic guideline by around 2060. So we will continue to closely monitor chloride on the watershed. For example, the CA will be adding a network of conductivity probes in the tributaries, and they have been calculating chloride loads into the lake. Recent contaminant monitoring updates were also provided in the 15-year report. Paul Helm of the Great Lakes Group at the MECP showed that microplastics, PFAS, and pharmaceuticals and personal care products were detected in Lake Simcoe water, but were below current guidelines. Satindra Basfar and his Sportfish Contaminant Group showed that levels of mercury, PCBs, and microplastics measured in key fish species, such as walleye, have generally declined. And 3 health units around the lake, that's the Durham, Simcoe, and York health units, showed their data on beach postings. And these are a swimming advisory they post at a public beach when bacteria levels increase above set guidelines. They showed that the number of beach postings were not associated with beach use, for example, the presence of waterfowl, dogs, or humans, but were associated with a variety of environmental conditions such as water temperature. The report showed that there has been some overall improvements to the lake. The top graph shows ice-free phosphorus averages from 1980 to 2024 at all of the lake stations. So we've seen an overall significant decrease in phosphorus, and this has occurred despite there's been no overall change in the phosphorus loadings into the lake. In particular, there's been a decline in phosphorus that started around 2010, and following 2015, the levels have remained quite low in the lake. At the deep lake stations, they're at about 8.5 micrograms per liter. Bottom graph shows the end of summer deep water dissolved oxygen levels at the deepest station in the lake, K42. So oxygen, the deep water oxygen has significantly increased overall. However, the levels can be quite variable, and there have been some low levels in recent years, like 2021. And I've shown there with the dotted line, the target in the protection plan of 7 milligrams per liter. So this target is an optimal level to help restore a self-sustaining cold water fish community and is the goal. So the dotted purple line now shown on the bottom graph is the predicted end of summer deep water dissolved oxygen concentration. So this we estimated using the traditional lake management model with the input of 5-year averages for phosphorus loadings. We use this model. It was based on previous work that had been done specifically for Lake Simcoe, but it is behind foundation of lake management for over 6 decades that connects the input of phosphorus to the lake's water quality. We see on the graph that up to 2009, the predicted and measured dissolved oxygen were very, very similar, validating this model. However, since 2010, measured dissolved oxygen values have consistently exceeded the predictions. So these results show that over the past 15 years, Lake Simcoe is not functioning as we previously understood. While phosphorus was historically the key stressor to the lake, climate change and invasive species are becoming key drivers of change. So I'm going to hand it over now to Brian, who will now introduce these key drivers.
Okay, thank you. As Joelle mentioned, there's a difference between the predicted and the observed conditions in the lake with respect to nutrients and also the deep water dissolved oxygen starting around 2010. And as such, we have been investigating why and how these well-known and fundamental ecological linkages have been broken. And there's really 2 main causes that we've been investigating. First is climate changes are affecting the nutrient supply to the lake, and then biological changes are affecting nutrient use within the lake. So first, with respect to climate change, how it's impacting how nutrients are delivered to the lake, there's large variations between years, especially with changes with respect to the timing, type, and intensity of precipitation. Rainfall during the winter months instead of snow, also intense summer downburst storms tend to lead to higher annual loads. Whereas when we have typical Ontario weather, a persistent snowpack like we have this year with a spring freshet and then drier summers, we tend to get lower annual phosphorus loads. I should point out that's not the volume of precipitation we receive in a year, but it seems to be related to how and when that precipitation falls. Climate change is also causing a shorter period of ice cover, warming and deepening the upper layer of the water column. This leads to longer stratification. And this is mostly caused by very clear water, which is mostly caused by invasive mussels. With this very clear water, sunlight travels deeper into the lake. The lake gets warmer. It takes longer for this warm layer to cool off, and that delays fall cooling and freezing. And this lack of freezing is the biggest change that we're seeing in the ice period. It also delays fall mixing at the end of the year. So there's a longer time between the deep water oxygen getting replenished and also a risk of lower fall oxygen. Next slide, please, Joel. So that's the changes in the drivers of the nutrients to the lake. What happens within the lake seems to be driven by the biology of invasive mussels. So as you heard in other talks, the zebra mussels arrived in the early 1990s. They peaked probably about 4 to 5 years after they arrived. They declined and they were finally replaced by quagga mussels in 2010. So these three maps that we show here show the expansion of quagga mussels from 3 surveys that we did using over 700 sampling sites and also counting and picking over 35,000 mussels in each one of these. There's a companion set of these maps, the zebra mussel maps, kind of showing the opposite trend, showing them dying off or declining. And these are available in the 15-year monitoring report. And there's a link at the end of the talk that you can link to. So despite the fact zebra and quagga mussels look very similar, they have critical ecological differences. Zebra mussels really require warm water. They're only active when the water temperatures are above 12 degrees Celsius. They require harder substrates for attachment, and they also have a very high food requirement. Quagga mussels, I like to refer them as version 2.0 of zebra mussels. They're more competitive. They can live on soft substrates. They can survive extended periods of low food, and they're active at all water temperatures above 4 degrees Celsius. So really, they're active year-round in Lake Simcoe, whereas the zebra mussels were more seasonal. And really, this feature with the quagga mussels has enabled colonization of the deeper water. As you can see on these maps, the darker the color is the higher biomass or the higher density, if you will, of quagga mussels. And you can see that they really invaded the deep water environment where there previously were no mussels before that. This invasion of the deep water and the expansion has really restructured the nutrient and the energy use in the lake. And this has been the focus of our current research. So the most recent map that we show here was done in 2023. The population in the lake is about 1.1 trillion mussels. 99% of them are now quagga mussels. And actually, the deep water population is now larger than the shallow water. I think I had an animation, Joelle, if you can click forward.
Trying.
But anyhow, the deep water population is actually now larger than the population that's in shallow water. So I think it's about 18 grams per meter squared of mussels in the deep water compared to 14 grams per meter squared in the deep water. And really, this has resulted in a very high filter capacity. Each mussel can filter about a gallon of water a day, which means that based on the population of the lake, they filter a volume equivalent to Lake Simcoe about every 3 to 4 days. So deep water mussels can filter the entire water column in spring and also in fall, but when the lake stratifies in the summertime, they're really cut off from this upper layer, and Claire will be mentioning some implications of that later on. So, next slide, please, Joelle.
Sadly, that's the problem here. It's not advancing anything with my computer again, no matter what I press. Let me see if I can try down here. Sorry about that.
Well, let me know if you'd like me to take control and I can move forward for you.
I think you should, because my computer is not responding. Mhm.
All right, I'm not able to change it either. Folks from Conservation Ontario, are you able to put up these slides so that we can continue?
Yep, just 1 second.
Great, thank you. I mean, we got halfway through the forum without our first major glitch, so I think we're doing pretty well overall. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Had to happen on our slides, right? So should I stop sharing?
Can you see my screen?
Stephanie, not yet. It's just starting to load now.
There we go. Okay, so.
Can you back up maybe? Thanks. Oh, back.
There you go.
There we go.
One more.
Perfect. Yeah, one more ahead.
I think we need the next slide. Sorry, it froze. Same slide. One moment.
Brian, it's that animation. It's just freezing everything.
It's all the data. I made people count 35,000 mussels, so it's all the data that's inside those maps. They're highly pixelated, so it freezes and stuff.
Maybe if we just start from the next slide instead.
Can we see now?
Yes.
Yep, that's perfect. So, so as I said, with the invasion of the quagga mussels into the deep water zone, they're filtering the lake in about every 3 to 4 days. This has resulted in really a change in the available phosphorus that's inside the lake water. Two main forms of phosphorus in the lake. There's particulate phosphorus and also dissolved phosphorus. Particulate phosphorus is removed by mussel filtering, and they actually leak out this dissolved phosphorus form. And in lake phosphorus, when you take water samples, is currently about 70 to 80% in this dissolved form. Dissolved phosphorus, why it is important is that this is the most biological available form. This favors uptake by algae. Typically, phytoplankton get removed and eaten by the mussels, but this gives an advantage to different phytoplankton groups and as well as macroalgae. And if you think of macroalgae, they're really the freshwater seaweeds that are kind of found in the shallow water environment. Freshwater seaweeds kind of obtain their nutrients from the water, whereas traditional aquatic plants such as pondweed and milfoils and that sort of thing take their uptake of nutrients from the sediment. So this change to dissolved phosphorus also favored the rapid expansion of invasive starry stonewort, and that's shown on these maps. Now we've done 4 iterations of a lake-wide plant survey over 240 sites across the lake. Starry stonewort was first found in the lake in 2009. By 2013, it had expanded almost lake-wide. By 2018, it made up over half of all the aquatic plants that are in the lake. And there was a crash in 2024. The population crashed, and now it's about 13% of the available aquatic plants are in the lake. Replacing this has been native muskgrass, and that's just because it's another type of freshwater seaweed, and it can exploit this amount of dissolved phosphorus that is in the lake more so than the particulate phosphorus. So, Claire, over to you. Oh, you are muted, Claire. So.
Better? Apologies. Thank you, Brian and Joelle. And I'm just going to build on what's already been said with really more of a scoped look at some aspects of water quality to illustrate how some of these changes might be manifesting in the lake. Oh, geez. Is that working? Oh, okay. No, I've gone too far now. Okay. So in particular, I'm going to talk about algae, also known as phytoplankton. So primary producers like algae, macroalgae, and aquatic plants can all produce and consume oxygen. And it's also important, they're also important in some situations, because in some situations, such as when it's a type of algae that can produce toxins, they can form blooms with undesirable effects.
However, it's really important to remember that not all blooms are unwanted. So some are actually really essential to ecosystem health. And primary producers also form an important link between nutrients in the lake and in the rest of the food web. So see, these are some of the patterns that we've observed related to algae and nutrients and the nutrients they consume in the last 15 years. So keep in mind that these represent average conditions over that time period. So individual years may have varied, and there also would have been differences among seasons and spatially within the lake. But in general, compared to previous conditions, the lake has been clearer in the late spring. So on the one hand, this means more light available for algal growth, but it also reflects that the water is clear because there are less particles, including algae, in the water. Average concentrations of phosphorus, as Joel mentioned, have been lower. So there was a decline in total phosphorus starting around 2010, and it's remained low in the open waters since around 2015. And there was a similar decline in chlorophyll concentrations, also starting around 2010. Mirroring the timing of water clarity, that decline was more apparent during the spring in the open waters of the lake. And coincident with these patterns, nitrate and silica. So typically these nutrients are drawn down by the growth of algae. And in particular, silica is used by diatoms for growth. So although we've seen lower average nutrients and lower chlorophyll concentrations, that doesn't necessarily mean there's been less primary production in the lake. There have actually been changes to where and when the production is occurring, and also by whom, as Brian mentioned. And it's really important to remember are not the only primary producers. So Brian was talking about some of the recent invaders that have changed the community structure in different parts of the lake. And this can really alter where processes affect dissolved oxygen and the food web are occurring. So with these added complexities, we really need a bit more of an integrated approach than we've used previously. Oops. So what are the ways that we've been changing our approach? To focus on trends in the average ice-free season, but a seasonal approach is showing new patterns. We're also working to improve our understanding of processes beyond the ice-free season, and in particular, look at the effect of changing winter conditions. And as I'll show you in the next slide, spatial patterns, so this is not just around the lake, but also with depth, these can be really important to understand. Since we only collect samples in our routine monitoring once every 2 weeks at a set number of regular locations, that often doesn't capture short-lived or spatially patchy events. And we're exploring how the use of new tools, such as remote sensing, can help us to fill those gaps. And other tools like stable isotopes, so Rebecca, our collaborator on this deck, she's working on that. Tools like that can also help us take a more integrated approach that incorporates things that are difficult to measure with our routine sampling. And improving the characterization of these types of variation will really aid in the understanding of factors that influence the amount and type of algae, as well as the related processes that affect nutrients, oxygen, and the food web. So next, I want to take you on a deeper dive into some of the mechanisms that drive the need for a different monitoring approach and why, for instance, seasonal average chlorophyll concentration is not enough to describe what primary producers are doing. I also want to show why relationships between nutrients, algae, and dissolved oxygen may be changing, as you recall that Joel mentioned earlier in the presentation. So we know that nutrients are important for supporting growth, but it's also important to consider other factors that affect the production and fate of algae. And this schematic is focusing on those other factors that affect the growth and loss of algae and how they vary within the lake and with different lake states. And so the illustration here is showing recent conditions. So there's quaggas covering the entire lake bottom. And on the left, you can see that in the shallow areas, they're well lit. And this is an advantage for macroalgae and rooted plants. So there's enough light for them to grow there. And so these represent a sink for nutrients. And changes in primary producers such as these are really important for the overall nutrient dynamics in the lake. So in the open waters, oops, sorry, go back one, there we go. So in the open waters of the lake, phytoplankton don't have to compete for light with primary producers on the bottom. And one of the key components, key controls in their growth, in addition to nutrients, is light. And when the water column is deeply mixed, the overall light they receive, because it's time integrated, is low. And this influences which type of phytoplankton can grow. And in this well-mixed state, the biomass of algae can also strongly be influenced by losses to quagga mussels that, as Brian mentioned, are feeding year-round. And this is a real change from when the zebra mussels dominated, because those were limited to more shallow water and they also didn't feed in colder temperatures. So we now see in the illustration contrast between the well-mixed state on the left and the stratified conditions on the right that occur when the lake's surface warms up. So phytoplankton accumulate in the surface layer. The layer below doesn't typically support accumulation of algae because there isn't enough light for growth to outpace losses that are due to sinking or grazing. And so where the layer stratifies above the bottom, it cuts quaggas off from the algae. And this can create patches where the algae is effectively protected from grazing by the mussels on the bottom. And because the nutrients are partitioned between these stratified layers, changes in the depth of mixing is also going to affect the size of the nutrient pool available to the phytoplankton in the surface layer. And this is really why changes in stratification that may be happening with climate change are important, and why the transition from zebra mussels to quagga mussels that went on from about 2010 to 2015 was so important for the fate of nutrients and also for processes affecting dissolved oxygen in the lake. And really the key takeaway from this schematic is that changes to key drivers have altered lake processes, and we're still really in the process of figuring out exactly what that means for lake monitoring and lake management. And what we've aimed to show you with this presentation is that Lake Simcoe is a changing lake, and it's no longer functioning as previously understood. And these complex changes are largely driven by changes in climate, by invasive species, but also by their interaction. And it's likely that the lake will continue to change in the coming decades. And it's really important that our monitoring and management strategy is collaborative and adaptive to these changes. So science-based decision-making and monitoring are essential to adaptive management, which is the foundation of the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. And while I feel like we've just scratched the surface with this talk, on the right are some places where you can find more detail in the form of reports. And those QR codes, there'll also be links in the chat for you to find those. So there's reports and also lake monitoring data that you can download. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd also like to acknowledge our colleagues who supports our water quality monitoring. We'd be happy to take any questions from the Q&A.
Thanks very much to all three of our presenters. We're a little bit tight on time for the schedule, so we'll only be able to take one question live, and then hopefully we can answer the rest in the QA. So this question is directed to Joelle from Rick. Why is there a gap in the dissolved oxygen in the late 90s?
Good catch on that, Rick. I believe it's 1999 where there was a gap in the data, and this was simply because sometimes equipment malfunctions can happen. I was not running the program at that time, but there were notes from my predecessor in the field data that the 1999 dissolved oxygen equipment wasn't working up to their specifications. They had removed it in some of the reports that they had put in notes, so I continue to remove that data point for ours. Then I'm not sure if you're also referring to the predictions that we do, but because I had shown the measured dissolved oxygen as well as the predicted dissolved oxygen from the 5-year phosphorus loading averages. And we don't actually have, we've only, it's quite a long time we've been measuring the phosphorus loadings, but we don't have measurements from before, like from the 1990s that we are using in our model predictions. So that's why there was also no predicted values there. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks very much, Joelle. I see that there are a few more questions in the chat, so perhaps the panelists could take a look there. Thank you, folks who have been addressing them to specific people. It's going to help out. But we will switch over to our next speakers, who are Emily Cowrie and Blair Wasilenko from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, who will be presenting an update of the Lake Simcoe fisheries research and assessment programs. Emily Cowrie is a biologist with the Upper Great Lakes and Lake Simcoe Research Unit at MNR, with a decade of experience in fisheries research across Algonquin Park, the Great Lakes, and Lake Simcoe. Blair Wasilenko has been with the Ministry of Natural Resources since 2002, starting out with the Student Experience Program, and has worked in various roles as a wildlife technician, fisheries biologist, and an aquatic ecosystem science specialist. In his current role as the program lead for the Inland Lakes Monitoring, he works with a diverse team of biologists, researchers, and technicians to deliver the provincial Inland Lakes Monitoring Program across the province, including Lake Simcoe. Emily and Blair, please take it away.
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, you're great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. Like Laura said, Blair and I are sharing this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about the research projects we have going on the lake, and then I'm going to hand it over to Blair, who's going to speak to the assessment programs. So I'm going to start off by talking about our acoustic telemetry projects. So in 2020, we deployed 44 receivers as part of an acoustic array across the lake, spread out in a grid. So these receivers are anchored to the bottom, about 1 meter off the lake bottom. And what they do is listen for detections of fish, which have been implanted with acoustic tags. These tags emit a unique signal when they swim within range of these receivers, which is then recorded with the unique ID and timestamp and stored until we download them in the spring. So as part of this project, we have tagged both lake trout and lake whitefish with the aim of understanding the seasonal behavior, movement, and habitat use, while also investigating the impacts of climate change and the role of dissolved oxygen and how that impacts the spatial distribution of these cold water species. So for those who are maybe unfamiliar with acoustic telemetry, I'll go through a quick overview of our methods. So each receiver is attached to an anchor, and like I said, it sits about 1 meter off the lake bottom. So it's suspended by buoys, and the actual receiver that's collecting that information and storing it is that piece of equipment right there. And then fish are surgically implanted with acoustic tags. So these tags are about the size of a AAA battery, and they're surgically implanted in the body cavity on the ventral side of the fish. And after the surgery, the sutures on the fish are visible, as you can see here, but they do tend to fade over time. After a short recovery period, the fish are then released back into the lake and ready to be recorded by the receivers. So these maps here are showing the progression of the receiver deployment, with most of the array, like I said, being deployed in 2020, and then some additional receivers being deployed in 2021 and 2022 to improve our coverage. They also show the location of where we've caught and tagged fish each year. So trying to tag in different locations across the lake. The figure on the right is showing the number of fish we've tagged each year and the proportion of the number of species we've tagged. So some years we're tagging more lake trout and some years we're tagging more whitefish. The bottom figure is showing the total number of fish that we've tagged per species, with the green representing the number of fish that are still alive and part of the study as of our last data download in spring of 2025. So what are we learning from this data? So from the detections of lake trout and lake whitefish collected through this acoustic array, we can get a better picture of how each species is occupying the lake during different seasons. So these maps are showing seasonal home ranges of each species, which is based on a center of activity. The shading represents the amount of overlap by individual fish. So for example, at the mouth of Kempenfelt Bay in the summer seasons, we can see that there's high areas of overlap for both species. And so these results were not completely unexpected because this is the deepest part of the lake. And during the summer, cold, well-oxygenated water is limited. So fish are moving to the deeper areas of the lake. From these results and continued collection of this data, we can learn more about the thermal preferences, the vulnerability of each species to angling, the catchability in our monitoring gear, and we can better understand the role that dissolved oxygen plays in habitat selection for these cold water species. We have also been conducting research on the larval life stage and diet of criggonines in Lake Simcoe to understand factors that could limit survival of these fish at this stage, and also to investigate why fish survival varies from year to year. So criggonines include lake whitefish and cisco, both of which have a similar life history. Larval fish emerge from the embryos in the spring and are found pelagically feeding on zooplankton near the surface. And it's during this time between ice out and early June that we're on the water, conducting some field work to collect larval fish and zooplankton samples using small mesh nets that are towed behind our boat. So like the net in that top right photo. By sampling both larval fish and zooplankton at the same site, we're able to get a sense of the food that's available to larval fish at this crucial point in their life cycle. Back in the lab, we use DNA barcoding to positively identify lake whitefish from cisco, and we are able to assess the body condition of the fish, collect aging structures to determine how many days old the fish are, and to extract their stomach contents to determine what and how much they're eating. So we can learn a lot from these little fish. So these top maps here are showing the density of larval lake whitefish compared to larval cisco in our catches at each of our sample sites for all of our sampling years combined. So they illustrate the wide distribution that both species have across the lake and the difference in species density in different areas. Our research group is also conducting similar research on Lake Huron, focusing on what is causing lake whitefish declines in that lake. As such, we're able to compare our results from Lake Simcoe with 5 areas in Lake Huron. So this bottom figure is showing the zooplankton availability for per larval fish at 4 of our Lake Huron sites and compared to Lake Simcoe. So we can see that Lake Simcoe has a higher number of zooplankton available per larval fish when compared to Lake Huron sites. While both these fish are affected by the invasion of quagga and zebra mussels, we know that Lake Simcoe is a more productive system, and we've not seen the same declines in lake whitefish as we have in Lake Huron. That said, there have been reductions in zooplankton since the invasion and establishment of these mussels, so we're continuing to investigate the effects on zooplankton availability while also looking at other factors that could limit the survival of larval fish, like climate change. Lastly, I'll talk about our hydroacoustic surveys. So every fall, we conduct hydroacoustic surveys in Kempenfelt Bay. We conduct these surveys to assess the status of pelagic fishes and understand the factors that influence population dynamics. So these surveys use sonar as an effective means of monitoring fish that occupy the midwater area, such as cisco, smelt, and emerald shiners, which are prey fish, and they make up an important component of the food web in the lake. So this figure on the bottom left is showing what we would see on the sonar while we're conducting the survey. And this band in the middle is a thick layer of fish. So to ground truth what we're seeing in the sonar and what makes up that layer of fish, we conduct companion nettings. So we're setting pelagic gill nets and we're doing pelagic trawling. And the pie charts at the bottom here are showing what we have caught in our 2024 netting survey, showing the proportion of each species caught when the net was set either at or above 12 meters or below 12 meters. And so this netting data then goes on to inform the analysis of the hydroacoustic data. And from our 2023 and 2024 surveys, we've learned that most fish size classes, the biomass estimates have decreased when compared to significantly higher levels in 2018 and 2019. Additionally, Cisco and perch numbers have decreased while smelt numbers have increased. This continued research helps us to track year classes through time and helps us to understand the population dynamics of these prey fish that are not often detected in regular monitoring gear. And so now I will pass it over to Blair, who will talk more about the assessment piece.
Thanks, Emily. Sorry. All right, I have control. Thanks, Emily. So in relation to some of the research work on Simcoe, we also do sort of long-term monitoring of different fish species. Historically on Lake Simcoe, we would do different types of methodology that would look at different parts of the fish community. So whether that would be in the shallow area, we would use what were known as nearshore trap nets. So think of big sort of minnow traps that would get larger fish in them. Or in the deeper part of the lake, we would do something called the OSBIN, the offshore benthic index netting surveys. In around 2008, M&R moved to what's more formally known as the broad scale monitoring across the landscape. So the picture on the left here is of all the sample lakes that we do across the province or have done across the province, using a methodology that looks more at the community of fish. So not necessarily focusing on the shallow or the deeper area, but sampling the whole water body. So picking up the littoral species and those deep water species, and more importantly, the species in between. So they're that cool water area. Lake Simcoe, over the last 6 or 7 years, we've moved from those individual surveys that look at different parts of the lake to the BSM survey that looks at the whole lake from the shallow to the deepest point. There's a lot of value in that from just focusing on one methodology, but also being able to compare that to what's going on in the other lakes within the province. And more specifically about Lake Simcoe, it is a provincially significant inland fishery, which means it can get a lot more monitoring or more focused monitoring. So Simcoe gets monitored annually right now with a BSM survey, as well as a open water creel and a winter creel. So those creels are where we are actually going and measuring the fishery itself. So talking to anglers and getting a sense of, you know, what they're targeting, how successful they are, how long they're fishing for. When we look at Lake Simcoe in terms of activity of fishing boats, we can see on the graph here, we used to do surveys, or we still do them on Lake Simcoe, where we fly over the lake and we count the boats in the summertime that are angling. So how many boats are out there on the water that are actually look like they're actively fishing? So they're not pulling a water skier, a kneeboarder, or a wakeboarder behind them, but they may have rods in there and they're in the act of fishing. We can see Simcoe is one of the highest amount of boats we see on the water body, provincially as well as in the southern part of the province, which is important. It's a very important lake provincially in terms of effort and having those fish resources there for people to harvest and get out and enjoy their day. If we look at the long-term trend in fishing efforts, so this isn't necessarily catch, this isn't harvest, this is the act of going and fishing. We can see across the bottom the years of the survey. Each one of these points is a survey or a creel. I will admit right now, this is not my deck, and I'm colorblind. So if I say the wrong color, don't hold it against me, but we'll go with shades here. So the lighter dots here are winter creels, and we can see a big uptick and then a downward sort of trend in the amount of effort that is going on in the winter. If we were to look at the summer itself, it's relatively constant. A little bit of dip in there, but probably not very significant. If we shift back to the winter, there's a couple of things that are happening. You'll see in the next couple slides. In the winter, you're typically, what we find people are focused on is catching perch, lake trout, whitefish. So as we saw in Emily's talk, we can see that lake trout and whitefish use a lot more of Lake Simcoe than they would in the summer months where they're sort of congregated there. But the other interesting thing that we're seeing in Lake Simcoe in the winter, and really it actually comes from the logistics of us going out to interview anglers, is that the ice is becoming less safe, or it's taking a longer time in the winter to become safe and be able to get bodies or trucks out onto it. So you do see a reduction in this effort. Some of it is tied to the available fish or what people are targeting there. But I think there is a real aspect of it to the ability of people to get out on the lake for that longer winter season. That winter season is becoming shorter due to the ice. When we look at, so this is shifting from creel to the netting data. So I'll just sort of give you the layout here. So on the left here, we have the catch per standard overnight set. So how many fish we are seeing in a net on average. On the bottom, we have the years of the survey, and then there's sort of two things that are happening here. The lighter colored icons are wild fish. The darker colored ones are stocked fish. And then there's two survey methodologies. So BSM are the circles that you see sort of coming around 2018 to present. And the triangles are old Osbin. So that netting that happens in the deeper parts of the lake, where BSM samples the deeper parts, but also the littoral area. And what we see is a reduction. We see a reduction in both wild and stock lake trout, but more so the stock lake trout. You see a fairly dramatic reduction over the years. In general, the catch for both of these, stocked and wild, regardless of the gear, has been relatively low. So these two species are in relatively low densities across Lake Simcoe. Lake whitefish, the other sort of cold water species that we're looking at, again, same sort of setup, just different species here. So triangles are our old methodology, where the circles are the newer methodology. There's sort of a different pattern here. So the wild have been relatively constant, maybe a little bit of a decline. And if you're to dig into the data a little bit more, that's really being upheld by a strong year class from the early 2000s. We do see new year classes coming in that are sort of sustaining the fishery from a wild standpoint. But you do see the reduction of stocked fish in terms of catch. So a little bit of a different story. Whitefish are still they're in relatively decent density. They're in relatively decent density compared to lake trout. But again, we're not getting the stocked fish sort of being recruited into the gear through time. Claire, Joelle, and Brian sort of talked about quagga mussels. When we look at perch, and this is a different gear. So in the lighter colors, we have that trap net that I talked about earlier. So these are really focusing on that 0 to 3 meters from the inshore, where BSM is looking from 0 meters to the deepest part of Lake Simcoe. We see through time, we've seen a reduction in the amount of perch that we were catching within the trap nets When we look to the BSM piece, it's relatively constant, though a little bit lower. And there's a number of things happening. And I think a theme from the two talks you've heard after the break here is a lot is sort of changed in Lake Simcoe. And, when we look at the primary producers or that really bottom end of the food web, we're now sort of looking at the top or middle end of it, and you sort of see that change happening. So with zebra mussels, they're generally in the littoral area, so close to shore. Quagga mussels are a little bit more offshore, so now they're taking up more habitat. They're clearing the lake a little bit, so making it a little bit clearer. You also have round goby establishing within that in the lake itself, so sort of sharing a bit of a niche or habitat with yellow perch. So you see with BSM, where we're capturing, and what we were not capturing with the trap nets, is you're seeing perch between 3 and 12 meters or 15 meters. So in our old monitoring, that was a bit of a gap in where we were not actually sampling that with the two methodologies that we had. And with that, I think Emily and I just wanted to thank the Upper Great Lakes and Simcoe research team, as well as Todd Langley and the Lake Simcoe monitoring staff. So happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Emily and Blair. We've got about 5 minutes left before our next presentation, so we'll hopefully be able to take one or maybe two questions. So an upvoted question was from Susan to Emily. To what extent are whitefish stocked in Lake Simcoe? Has your research given an overall picture of the survival rate of fry that are in the lake due to natural reproduction?
Sorry, I'm just catching up here. Could you just repeat the question? Oh,
sure.
I see it here.
To what extent are whitefish stocked in Lake Simcoe? And has your research given an overall picture of the survival rate of fry that are in the lake due to natural reproduction?
Yeah, so there are, lake whitefish stocked. I'll have to get back to you on the overall numbers. But yeah, this is looking at the natural reproduction, our larval fish work. But I can give a more detailed answer if that can be directed to my email.
Great. And we
Can
have
maybe add on to that, Emily?
Yeah, if you could.
Within our group, Emily and I are in the science and research branch of M&R. Stocking actually occurs at a district level. We are in conversation with the district around that. That number has sort of, it changes through time. But we can definitely get those numbers at what they're at. And I think the district releases those numbers annually about their stocking plans.
Okay, that's great. And we've got that question from 9:30 this morning, waiting for you guys to come back on. Are there any updates on the level of disruption and size of populations of common carp and round goby in Lake Simcoe?
So we have just finished our aging and our capture from last year. The person that was supposed to give the presentation could not make it today. He is the keeper of that data. I will have to get back to you on that. I could make an educated guess, but it probably wouldn't do us well here.
Fair enough. Probably better to follow up by email and get the correct answer that we know for sure is right. All right. Just to keep us on time, I don't know if we have time to answer another long question. Maybe there's a quick one. Blair, why do you think the natural lake trout and introduced are not making new little fish? Or is that what you're saying? They don't hang out?
It's a great question. From the wild stock perspective, I wouldn't be able to pin down an individual answer, but I think with what we're hearing today and sort of this changing of the lake, different invaders, different water quality parameters, lake trout are a fairly sensitive species to all of those things. I would think that the reason falls within what has gone on over in Simcoe over the last number of years. And then trying to address those questions about the why and how we can sort of get around that leads into some of Emily's group's research as well as the monitoring.
Okay, right on. Thank you for that. And puts us perfectly on time to switch over to our lightning round. So just a reminder for folks in the chat, again, please continue to upvote. Please continue to flag which presenter you are directing your question to, which is going to be particularly important for the lightning round, because in this format, each speaker has 6 minutes to present, and the talks are back to back with a big QA at the end. We'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So please make sure to direct your comments your questions in the QA to the specific person that you have a question for. So we have 4 speakers in our lightning round. Catherine Eimers, a professor and associate director at Trent University, specializing in freshwater biogeochemistry, nutrient cycling, and the impacts of land use and climate shifts on watershed health. Catherine will be presenting on agricultural intensification and dormant season water quality. Leedy Shih is our second presenter and is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, focusing on physical processes in lakes and reservoirs and their ecological implications. Leedy will present on ecological memory of winter conditions in Lake Simcoe. Third is Christopher Wellen, who is an associate professor from the Toronto Metropolitan University, focusing on the intersection of hydrology and biogeochemistry in human-dominated environments. Christopher will present on projections of long-term chloride concentrations in Lake Simcoe. And finally, Joshua Culpepper is a postdoctoral researcher and limnologist from York University, studying how climate change and seasonal weather patterns affect lake temperatures, ice cover, and ecosystem health. Josh will present on how drastically differing winters modify ice quality and under ice thermal habitat and productivity in Lake Simcoe. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Catherine Eimers, on agricultural intensification and dormant season water quality. Catherine.
Okay, thank you. My screen visible and you can hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks. So, oops, hold on. There we go. So agriculture has changed pretty dramatically in Ontario. It's become more intensive. And since at least the 1970s, there have been dramatic increases in the amount of land devoted to growing 3 particular row crops. That is corn, soybean, and winter wheat. And this has not involved an expansion in the footprint of agriculture, not in the Southern Ontario context anyways, but rather has involved a shift from what we would call mixed agriculture, where farmers would be producing a mixture of livestock and row crops, to greater specialization. So fewer but larger farms specializing in one particular commodity, so livestock or row crops. And since the 1970s, really 3 particular row crops have taken off, and now corn, soy, and wheat, winter wheat is the predominant rotation in Ontario. And as we can see in the bottom left graph, the amount of productivity of those 3 crops has more than doubled since the 1970s, and this is really the hallmark of intensification. So how has that production increase occurred? Well, attendant with those expansions in field crop area have been expansions in tile drainage. Now, tile drainage is not a new thing. Like many areas in Ontario have been tile drained for more than a century, but it's expanding into areas that previously were not tiled. So modern day tiles are these perforated plastic pipes, as you see in the top right, and they're installed about 1 meter below the soil surface. It may be a 10-meter spacing in an array under the soil, under the field. They connect to a header pipe, which then discharges directly into the recipient water body, be it a ditch, a river, or the lake directly. And so they bypass traditional best management practices like riparian buffers. So drainage is a really great agronomic technique. By drawing down soil moisture in the seasonally wet periods of the spring and the fall, they allow farmers to get out earlier with their seeders. They're not sinking in mud up to the axles. They can plant earlier in the spring because the soils are drier and they're also warmer, and they can get out later in the fall to harvest. And so that extends the growing season and improves crop yield. However, these changes in row cropping and in tile drainage come with them some concerns for water quality. And it's interesting that the effects on water quality are quite mixed. So dual effects. So on the one hand, there's been improvements in phosphorus losses from agricultural fields that have undergone this shift because tile drainage, by improving vertical drainage through the soil profile, they're minimizing surface ponding, reducing overland flow, and reducing the loss of those really valuable soil particles from the surface soil that are rich in organic matter, but also rich in phosphorus. That's a good thing, reducing particulate phosphorus delivery to our waterways. But on the flip side, because they're so efficient at moving water, they also move anything that is dissolved in water. So this means nutrients like the nitrate form of nitrogen, as well as dissolved phosphorus, can be moved more effectively, efficiently in tile drains to recipient water bodies. And just a final note is that corn and soybean, two of those most common field crops these days, are both really nitrogen intensive. So corn has a high nitrogen use, but low nitrogen use efficiency, and soybean is a legume that fixes nitrogen. So as I said, tile drainage is not new to Ontario. At this scale, it looks like there's really no space for tile drainage to expand in the southwest. All those purple polygons are tile drains, recorded tile drainage, as well as in the Ottawa Valley. But the records show that even in those areas that are already extensively tiled, tile drainage density is increasing, meaning that new pipes are being put in between existing pipes. And perhaps a more concern or more surprising to people on this call is that tile drainage is also expanding into areas that we wouldn't traditionally think need tile drainage or artificial drainage. So if you look at a soil map, a drainage map, these are areas where we would think, okay, the soils are fairly coarse textured, the topography is fairly sloped, and so natural drainage should prevail. However, tile drainage is going into those areas as well, attendant with those increases in row crop production. And I work in areas, from Peterborough down towards Lake Ontario shoreline, and farmers tell me that all fields can benefit from tile drainage. And again, it's the seasonality of our climate, seasonally wet periods in the spring and unpredictable soil moisture in the fall. Tile drainage always helps farmers to weather the weather and could even be considered a climate change adaptation technique. So you can kind of see the outline of Lake Simcoe here, showing the amount of tile drainage, known tile drainage, and these records are definitely an underestimated true tile drainage. So I don't have monitoring data specifically from Lake Simcoe, but I do have monitoring data from just east of Lake Simcoe, from the Kawartha Lakes watershed, as well as the Ganaraska, Gages, and Cobra Brook watersheds. And we see time and time again, when we monitor the tiles and we monitor the rivers or creeks that they discharge to, nitrate levels, as expected, are really, really high in the tiles, and they do exceed water quality guidelines. Whereas in the rivers that they're draining to, they're not exceeding those water quality guidelines. And so perhaps we could just say, oh, no big deal. But I guess the point I'm trying to say in this talk is that we should keep our eye on nitrate, because with those changes in land cover, we are most likely going to see nitrate concentrations creeping up in rivers and lakes as well. Total phosphorus concentrations in tiles and streams aren't really that different. They pretty much always routinely exceed water quality guideline of 30 micrograms per liter. But typically, most of the phosphorus in the tiles is dissolved. I don't have dissolved data to show you here, but the turbidity data suggests that most of the phosphorus present in those tiles in the tiles is actually dissolved. Another take-home message from this is that tiles don't just change water quality, but they also change the thermal dynamics of streams, or they can. So we've been monitoring tile water temperature as well as temperature of the streams that they discharge to. And so the right box whisker plot there is showing how tile drainage water temperature is usually at least 4 degrees higher than the recipient rivers that they discharge to. Those thermal changes have unknown consequences for stream ecology, but they certainly have influences on ice dynamics. So on the right side, you're seeing a branch of the Ganaraska River that we've been monitoring for a few years. There's a tile outlet that's discharging to this creek. The water is flowing towards us. And so you can see that upstream of the tile dish outlet, the river is frozen. Downstream, it's clearly open water. So effects on downstream ice dynamics, unknown. So lessons learned from this very, very short talk is that changes in nutrient stoichiometry should be expected with this change in land cover that we're seeing. So meaning more nitrogen relative to phosphorus. And because tiles discharge pretty much continuously through the winter, so even this really cold winter, we're measuring tile flow right now. They dry up in the summer, but they flow continuously through the winter when we're not always out there monitoring. We may be missing some important changes in nutrient stoichiometry. And lastly, tile flow affects more than just water quality. We have done some work on hydrology stream flashiness, but also thermal regime and ice dynamics. And just to acknowledge some of the funders and collaborators on this work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine.
Up to 6 minutes.
I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Lidi Shi, who will be presenting on dissolved oxygen production. So Lidi, if you're ready to share your screen, please go ahead.
Okay, that's great. Can you see my screen clear?
Yes, we
And
can.
my
Go ahead.
voice clear?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Okay, I will start. Hello, everyone. My name is Li Gish, come from the University of Toronto. And now I'm a postdoctor cooperator with Professor Matthew Wills in the University of Toronto. And today it is really my great pleasure for me to have this opportunity for this presentation. And today I will bring the topic about the ecological memory of the winter condition in Lake Simcoe. And the specific title here is the role of our winter oxidation dynamics in setting the spring and summer dissolved oxygen levels in a larger ice-covered lake. And this research was conducted in Lake Simcoe, that is Great Lake region. But before starting the presentation, we should bring one thank you question in our mind. Does the on-ice dissolved oxygen in winter show any ecological memory across different lake seasons? And this question will be throughout the whole presentation in this research. This research mainly focuses on the dissolved oxygen. So why we care about the deoxygenation of the lakes is mainly because the deoxygenation of lakes due to the combination of the eutrophication and climate change is a pressure issue worldwide, which could directly impact the fish survival and the aquatic system. So here we may ask a question: what are the possible drivers of the deoxygenation in Dominican lakes? And in the history point, people usually thought that the open water deoxygenation has been largely related to the Hoflinia oxygen demand, which is influenced greatly by the longer summer vacation and increased oxygen sake. But besides these factors, the winter condition could also play an important role through the carryover effect, which we may also call it ecological memory, to affect the summer gill conditions. However, most studies on the summer hypothesis are often separated to the winter periods. This mainly because of the periods as the red window shows, as we call it, spring mixing. But if this mixing period is short or incomplete, the winter dissolved oxygen depletion could last into the falling, spring, and summer seasons. So under this circumstance, we could see that the winter period is very important to summer gill conditions. And based on this, we could ask the following scientific question, as shown in the first slides. Does the on-ice dissolved oxygen in winter show any ecological memory across different lake seasons? And to address this question, this presentation will utilize the 6 years of high-frequency water temperature and dissolved oxygen conducted in Lake Simcoe for further analysis. And here we show the 6-year winter temperature and dissolved oxygen, as shown in the red fingers. We could from the two group of this two group panels of the water temperature and dissolved oxygen, we could see that the dissolved oxygen over the 6-year winters were closely related to the water temperature, especially with the surface mixed layer. And to be specific, we could see that the higher dissolved oxygen were detected within this layer, and the lower dissolved oxygen were observed below this layer. And also, the water temperature and dissolved oxygen also show different patterns for both colder and warm winters. That means the longer ice-cover duration could lead to a longer inverse multiplication, and as a result, the Hoflinia hypoxia zone were more intensive in the cold winter, such as the winter of 2015 and 2022. were more extensive when compared that to these warm winters. And in action, the supersaturated dissolved oxygen was detected in the cold winter 2015 and 2022 at the end of this at the end of that cover period. When combined with the biweekly summer samples, we could see that the dissolved oxygen could continuously decrease in the following spring and summer seasons. And this decrease could be estimated based on the calculation of the linear oxygen reduction as shown in the equation. And this oxygen reduction could account for about 54% of the initial gill values. And this indicates that in addition to the linear oxygen reduction, the initial gill values could also play an important role affecting the thermal gill conditions. So when we look back to the question that we asked before, does the on-ice dissolved oxygen in winter show any ecological memory across different lake seasons? The answer should be yes, and this can be further confirmed by the strong and tight relationship between the Earth-off and thermal gill values. That is higher late winter dissolved oxygen levels would lead to a higher end-of thermal gill values. Okay, that is all.
Thank you very much, Leedy. And you made it exactly in your 6-minute window. So congratulations with my little timekeeper watch on the side.
Okay.
I would like to welcome our next speaker, Christopher Wellen, who will be presenting on chloride research.
Yes, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Oh. All right. That looks good, right?
Yep, you're good. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for coming and organizing Lake Simcoe Science Forum and inviting me here. So I'll be talking to you about some projections of where chloride concentrations in the lake are likely to be towards the end of this century. Bill did a really nice job kind of introducing the issue of road salt as a major issue in Lake Simcoe. There's been a lot of literature published on it, a lot of data on it throughout in the literature. One thing that hasn't been talked about a lot is that there are important ecotoxicological thresholds that are important regarding chloride in the lake. I'm not an ecotoxicologist, but I can report on some of that to you today. The CCME, Canada Commission of Ministers in the Environment, has suggested a guideline of 120 milligrams per liter as a guideline. There's been a lot of research showing that that might not be sufficiently protective for a lot of temperate lakes. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of, as we talk about the thresholds that are projected in the future, we're going to be comparing them to the 120 milligrams per liter guideline, as well as a lower guideline of 80 milligrams per liter. So for people who like math in the morning, you can take a good look at this mass balance model. For people who don't, just realize that the mass balance model that I have and I'm presenting about today is developed by Jafar Safari. He's a research associate in my research group. And the important thing to understand is that it's built on principles of mass balance, not on extrapolating trends and not really on statistics. So the mass balance processes that we really consider are really just inflow from, we kind of break the lake into 5 different segments, which you see here on the bottom right. And we look at concentration dynamics in each of those segments because they can be different from each other. Cooks Bay and Kempenfelt Bay are receiving a lot of urban runoff. And so we would expect and we see that those embayments have higher chloride concentrations than the lake as a whole. And so it's important to kind of disaggregate the lake to an extent. And that's what we do. We track the concentration at an annual time scale using inputs from the watershed, concentrations that are observed in the lake, as well as exports through the Atherley Narrows outflow. We also found it necessary to incorporate processes of lake segments, essentially mixing with each other over the annual timescale, as well as some of the lake water was estimated to exit the lake faster than the residence time of the entire lake. So what we call that is bypass flow. Now, that's a very simple lake model that it was sufficient to describe the dynamics, and I'll show that to you in a minute. We also have estimates of chloride source areas that we use a simple export coefficient model. The LSRCA does an excellent job looking at the evolution of the landscape, how much area of roads and parking lots are expanding and changing. And we essentially use the chloride estimates in the stream to estimate at 16 points in the stream to estimate where the chloride is coming from and how much. And we have some estimates here. So just for reference, we're estimating that the roads actually are losing far more chloride per area than natural land, which is what we would expect. But that parking lots are actually estimated to be losing about twice what roads are per area. This map here is a map of the average estimated source areas, which is exactly what you'd expect. It's where the urban areas are. I don't want to dwell too much on this. The mass balance model fit relatively well. These are the time series plots in all of the different compartments in the lake, and the fit is generally pretty good. As you do get further downstream, you do start to notice some kind of a bit of lack of fit, but this fit is still quite good. We wanted to know, the whole point of this modeling exercise in this talk is to estimate what will happen as urban areas expand. And so we had a build-out scenario. The build-out scenario that we designed is essentially looking at where the designated settlement areas are, subtracting the existing urban areas, looking at where the existing agricultural areas are. Our assumption was that that's where urbanization would happen, and assuming that all of those agricultural areas within the designated settlement areas would become urban areas, and then we applied the export coefficients to those areas. So this resulted in a 15% increase of parking lot road area, and 34% increase of parking lot area. So these are the results. So a couple things to point out about these results. One is that it shows the importance of taking this disaggregated effect. You get different concentration dynamics in the different basins. For the build-out scenario, it does look like Kempenfelt Bay will be exceeding the 120 milligram per liter threshold by the end of the century, where other basins are definitely exceeding that 80 milligram per liter, the lower 80 milligram per liter threshold by 2060 with that build-out scenario. Bill also mentioned the parking lot, the limited liability model, and that's essentially what we're trying to do with this parking lot management scenario, is to ask, well, what if we just assume that it worked as well as we're hoping, and that the export coefficient of the parking lots goes down to what the road one is. It goes down by about 50%. And that's what you see on the plot to the right, and there are significant decreases in the overall chloride concentration in all of the basins. So there are significant benefits that we're expecting from that, and that really benefit warrants more investigation. So I believe I'm out of time now. But these are my main findings. Please contact me should you wish to discuss them further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate the attention to time and also the information that you shared. I'd like to welcome our final presenter in the lightning round, Joshua Culpepper with Under Ice Research in the Lake. At the end of Joshua's talk, there's going to be a short video about York University's work in Lake Simcoe.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. So we're going to be talking about ice quality and how variable winter conditions can impact under ice quality, thermal habitat, and other water quality variables. Okay, and I want to quickly thank my funders and also my lab mates for all of their assistance in the field. So what are we talking about when we talk about ice quality? You can see these two kind of conceptual models with a more black ice scenario and a more white ice scenario. Black ice is really that clear ice that forms into the lake, whereas white ice is more superimposed on top of the black ice from re-freezing slush and snow that is maybe melted or filled in with rainwater, for example. And some of the main things that we find is that under cold, calm conditions, we expect more black ice. Often under warmer conditions and lots of kind of freeze-thaw events, we get things like more white ice. One of the key factors of black ice is this low albedo, permitting a lot of light to transmit through, and that implies that there can be more different types of communities for algae and zooplankton, and that may have some effects on larger predators like fish. When you have less light traveling through, the higher albedo of white ice, the amount of light it can reflect, you get, less light underneath, less potential growth for algae and some of those higher level trophic impacts. Black ice is also stronger. You can see on that top panel, we put a truck there. Black ice is a bit stronger, especially at temperatures near 0 degrees Celsius. You can have some potentially dangerous conditions with white ice. Combining all of these ideas, we started to think about how do winter hydroclimate variability, how does that impact ice quality, as well as the under ice water quality conditions, kind of the ramifications of these effects. And again, you can kind of see this on Lake Simcoe on the left here. This is, again, all black ice. You can kind of see how clear it is. We're looking into the lake water. Again, a large urban lake with a large fetch, so lots of wind that can blow off snow. And then Paint Lake, we also sampled about an hour and a half north of Lake Simcoe in the Muskoka area. And we were lucky enough to get a warm, dry year and a cold, snowy year. So here you can see more of that opaque ice when the forested area kind of traps snow on the lake surface. Here you can see the really dynamic difference between the two winters. So on the left, on Kempenfelt Bay, we have the warm winter on the far left panel, and we got a maximum of 15 centimeters measured of black ice. We were actually only able to go out about 4 times. There were some safety concerns with the ice. But then in the cold winter, you can see upwards of 52 centimeters of ice about a year later. Also a significant portion of white ice in addition to that large black ice section. Up in the shallower Paint Lake, you can see that white ice is a consistently forms on the lake surface. However, a smaller black ice region, you can see in the snowier, colder winter, you get a much more complex white layer sheet, as well as a thicker black ice sheet. And one of the things that snow and white ice impact is light. So you can see that with the higher amount of snow thickness on that top panel, you get less and less light, more than 3 centimeters, and photosynthetically active radiation. That's the visible wavelengths of light that algae use to photosynthesize. It almost completely disappears below snow. We removed the snow and measured light through just the ice sheet. You can see that there is more light overall, but it has a similar shape. And Lake Simcoe, with primarily black ice, has a lot of, with that clarity from the black ice, you get a lot more light. Now, I know this is a little bit complex, but let's go ahead and just pay attention to that top row. That's Kempenfelt Bay. And on the left, we're looking at temperature of the water column. In the middle, we're looking at dissolved oxygen in the water column. And on the right, we're looking at chlorophyll. So what we saw is that when ice formed later in 2024, it was able to mix the water column well, and we got colder water temperatures. We also got more oxygenated water temperatures in 2024 from that mixing and that later ice formation. However, when ice formed early, there was a warmer area lower in Kempenfelt Bay in that lower water column. Again, it's an overall cold basin, but some warmer water down low, and also dissolved oxygen. We see that there's a section of lower dissolved oxygen. We use 8 milligrams per liter because some cold water fish can experience oxidative stress at that temperature. In 2024 for chlorophyll, with all that light, we saw a deeper chlorophyll maximum of about 15 meters, kind of more spread out. But in 2025, with all of the snow, we saw a peak very early near the surface. And then once the snow and white ice melted, we saw more chlorophyll. Also in the northern basin, we saw impacts of road salts, this red line is the highway that's plowed and salted. All of these blue lines are roads that are unsalted. And the shallow basin in Paint Lake saw heavy influences of road salt with high warming of the water column, anoxic conditions, so very low oxygen, and the basin failed to mix in the spring with all the flushing of the snow. And with that, I wanted to share a documentary that one of our former students made.
Ice on dates are becoming later, ice off dates are becoming earlier, and we're seeing the shorter duration of ice cover. In the last 25 years, ice loss is actually 6 times faster. So declining ice thickness and also changing ice quality.
Some of the major drivers of changing ice quality are temperature, primarily, and subsequently snow precipitation variation. So temperature basically just controls how much ice can form overall. And then snow is primarily what governs the white ice formation process. That snow forms on that initial layer of black ice. And then through subsequent freezing and melting or flooding of that pore space, that creates more and more white ice.
For humans, less ice has a variety of consequences. With warmer temperatures, with increased freeze-thaw events, with just changes in our climate, we're seeing more of these white ice conditions, and it's half as strong. And what we found was that more people drowned in warmer winters, and there was this really tight relationship between warmer winter air temperatures and the number of fatal drownings. Particularly alarming because ice is so important for hunting, for snowmobiling, for ice fishing.
Every year we come up for the Berry Winterfest. Hope that there's some ice so we can get out here and fly some of the bigger kites. There's been a couple of years I was out and it made me nervous when people came to stand next to me. Well, I knew it was enough for me. I wasn't so sure about other people.
Ice is becoming less safe in the winter months to get access to food, fuel, medicine, and also community networks. Winter ice roads are really important culturally because they connect often remote regions.
The thickness of the ice is changing right now. It's very scary for a lot of our people to transport the young, transport our harvests, and in that same stance we have to learn how to navigate in different paths, and that means also gambling with different areas.
Understanding ice ecology is crucial to adapting to its changes.
What we're doing is we're able to see the evolution of the ice column through time. And then we're taking other limnological variables such as temperature and oxygen and phytoplankton and light. And one of the main impacts that ice quality has on under ice ecosystems is the availability of light. So if you have a white ice layer in snow or a black ice layer in snow, you're getting almost no light coming through the ice surface. Whereas if you were to just have black ice, you can get plenty of light for things like photosynthesis to occur.
As ice degrades in quality and thickness and stays frozen for shorter periods, organisms, people, and ecosystems must adapt. Uncertainty can melt into curiosity and resilience.
Kind of anticipating seeing what's going to happen has been really interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you for the presentation and for sharing that video. So with that, our presentations are complete and we'll be able to go to the lightning round QA. We've got a few questions in the chat. I saw that Martin has a comment. Just a comment, phosphorus removal filters at ends of drain tiles are used in the Lake Erie Basin bilateral phosphorus removal plan. Okay, thank you for that, but we'll take a question. I see that Susan's question is being answered by Catherine. So perhaps we'll move to, oh, goodness, there's lots of comments, but not that many questions. Oh, one from Andrew. What is the percentage annual flow to Lake Simcoe from all its tributaries? Have you identified which of those tributaries contribute the most negative impacts? And are there plans to reduce those negative impacts in each of those tributaries? I'm not sure which of the panelists that was directed to, perhaps Chris Wellen, but if anybody would like to speak in that, panelists, please feel free to unmute yourselves and answer. Or Andrew, if you want to make another comment just to let us know who that was directed to, that would be great. And if you want to answer live, you don't have to answer just in the chat. Either one is fine. But it does leave me filling lots of time talking if everybody's answering written down. So you're just going to have to listen to my chatter while we wait for those answers. So I'll just read some of the comments here. Susan commented to Joshua that they just wanted to point out that Lake Drive in Georgina, which is labeled unsalted on the map that was shown, actually is salted with thaw rocks, which is largely composed of salt. And then Susan followed up with a comment that makes you wonder whether municipalities that are using thaw rocks are claiming that they don't use salt.
Thank you for that clarification, Susan. I appreciate it. And I'll pass it along to the main author on that study, just so he knows. And maybe we can kind of get to the bottom of that. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Ed for Catherine. For tile drain VMPs, do you see an increase in drainage water management control or drainage water recycling, or both?
Sorry. Yeah, I think you're probably asking specifically in the Lake Simcoe watershed, which I don't have any data on, honestly. But in terms of tile drain VMPs, yeah, controlled tile drainage is an option, but it's not possible at many outlets. The slope has to be just right, and accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. But no, maybe somebody from the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority would be able to answer that one.
Not sure if any of our LSRCA panelists are able to answer that, but that might be worthwhile following up with as an email. Presenters' emails are available in the materials for this. Oh, Bill, I see you're on camera.
Yeah, I guess my background is very bright. Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. Our restoration program, of which I'm not part, does have funding for agricultural operations, farmers. That does include water control structures on the end of tiles. And it's still, as I understand it, a relatively small program in our watershed, but it's one that has been taken up by some farmers and one we're keen to see taken up elsewhere. I will say there was another similar question that I noticed in the Q&A that kind of passed by, talking about the rate of farmer adoption of best practices like these. I'm sure anyone in any conservation authority, any organization would give the same answer. We'd like to see more of it. We actually are doing some research right now funded by OMAFRA to understand how we can increase the adoption of better practices by farmers in the watershed. And one of the things we're finding through that is there's a lot of farmers doing things and just not telling us, and good things, and not telling us and not seeking the funding, just kind of adopting the best practices because they'd rather do it on their own rather than work with a government agency. So yeah, it's a very interesting landscape to work on the agricultural landscape and promoting adoption of voluntary practices by farmers.
Thanks, Bill. Just a comment from Sapna, who was featured in the video, that the sound or the music didn't really come through in the presentation here. So Sapna's posted a link in the Q&A, and I believe it's also in the chat. If you'd like to watch the video again with sort of full sound and sort of a no buffering the way it is when it's presented through a Zoom, you can follow that link to to watch it again. There's another question from Ed for Catherine. What percentage of drainage acres in the Simcoe watershed or other watersheds in the purple populated map display are impacted by Hickenbottom tubes?
Again, I don't know that answer. Sorry. Maybe somebody from OMAFA would know that.
Yeah, I don't think we have anybody from OMAFA on the panel right now. So that's something that would probably be best sent in by email, and then we could provide sort of connections to the right people who might have that information. All right, and our last question here is from Andrew. Well, I guess more of a comment. The presentations have been helpful, but are mostly snapshots. My question seeks a comprehensive answer from those managing the LSPP, perhaps after the webinar. So yeah, if you have questions that we weren't able to get to or that you'd like more information on, panelist emails are available in the materials. So please feel free to follow up as needed. So last one is from Claire, and then I think we'll probably have to wrap. Sounds like we know that DO was going down with reduced ice cover. So at what point does the future, future casting research inform management decisions? Also had a question in here about starry stonewort or mussel removing phosphorus in the column likely to crash, which we would think would lead to an increase in phosphorus in the water. So there are two sources of data that show us we need to anticipate a much worse future. What conversations, actions are underway to mitigate this? And I guess it's a question for me or for Bill. Bill, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to say to address Claire's question.
Actually, if I could defer it to Brian, if he's still tuned in, I think this is a limnology question that he'd be better able to answer than I could.
Is Brian still on the line with us? Oh, there he is. Perfect.
Yeah, still here. Yeah, we did. The year that the starry stonewort did die back was 2020, and there was a bit of a phosphorus uptick in the water during that year. So the dissolved phosphorus did increase just because it wasn't being uptake quite as well. So there was probably a bit more algae or something like that during that summertime. But with the takeover by native freshwater seaweeds, so yeah, it's come back down again. So. Yep.
Thanks, Brian. We've got one last question. I think we have time for it, which was from Katerina. Does anyone have commentary on the impacts of boathouses along the shore? Not sure if there's anybody on the panel who would be able to provide impact on that or input on that, pardon me. It doesn't look like we have anybody who might be able to speak to that today, unfortunately. So I think we'll probably need to wrap up the Q&A now. I would like to thank everybody who participated today. All of our presenters, our behind-the-scenes crew, both from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks and from Conservation Ontario. And of course, a really big thank you to the Latornell Conservation Symposium for hosting this webinar and giving us an opportunity to share Lake Simcoe science with all of the interested folks who attended today. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of your day to attend the session this morning. I know we all value Lake Simcoe, and it's been really great to share what we know as a group. So thank you for your time. And with that, I will hand it over to our host, Mike, to close us out.
Great. Thanks again, Laura. That concludes our program. Thank you to all presenters, as Laura mentioned. And once again, the webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on YouTube. Please also remember to complete the post-event survey that you'll receive by email. And then finally, also stay tuned for more conservation themed content as part of the Latornell Conservation Symposium. And that would include future webinars, opportunities for professional development. And that's it. On behalf of the Latornell Conservation Symposium Steering Committee, we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.